Ms. Bembenek, do you have any questions about that charge itself?
No, sir.
I accordingly find the defendant, Laurencia Bembenek, guilty of second-degree murder.
They called her Bambi with her long, slender legs and big doe eyes.
I opened the door, and there were two police detectives, and they said, "You're under arrest."
Laurie Bembenek looked like a stone-cold killer.
Woman on the run, Laurencia Bembenek, is now behind prison bars for life.
A former calendar girl and a former cop who can bend men at her will.
She stands convicted again of killing a young woman while her small children slept in nearby beds.
Laurie had faced many accusations over the years.
I can't convince them that I didn't do it.
But when she was accused of killing her husband's ex-wife, Christine Schultz, Laurie would face the greatest hardship of her life. It was Laurie's femme fatale image that sealed the deal when it came to pinning her to this murder. And unluckily for her, the jury bought it. But now, decades later, Laurie's case brings more questions than answers. Was Laurie framed? Was the real killer closer to home? And was Laurie the unfair scapegoat of a rigged system designed to suppress the rights of women and enforce gender norms? Laurencia, also known as Laurie, her life was far from typical, shaped by a combination of beauty, ambition, and a desire to rise beyond her modest beginnings. Born in 1958 in Milwaukee, Laurie grew up in a blue-collar Polish-American family. Her father was a factory worker, and she was raised in a Catholic household, which would later influence her moral struggles. Before her father became a carpenter and a factory worker, he was a cop, but he quit because he was seeing a lot of corruption with the police force. The ideals he had would go on to shape Laurie's strong sense of justice. From an early age, Laurie was known for her striking looks. And I mean, look at her, she is beautiful. But she was also determined to do more than just rely on her appearance. She excelled in school, but she often felt left out because she didn't believe in the conventional expectations that were placed on a woman in that generation. This tension would only grow as she entered adulthood and faced a world of the 1970s where there was very limited opportunities for women. After high school, Laurie enrolled in college hoping to study art, but soon found herself drawn towards a career in law enforcement. The idea of her joining the police force made her feel like she was doing something meaningful. She wasn't interested in being in traditional female roles like being a secretary, a nurse, or a teacher. It was clear that Laurie wanted more, so she joined the Milwaukee Police Academy, and she was one of the only women in that class. It wasn't easy at all, and being a female cop in the 1970s was a battleground. Laurie faced both blatant sexism and subtle resistance from her male counterparts. Women in law enforcement were often treated as if they weren't able to do the same tasks as men, and Laurie, who was very outspoken, had a lot to say about this and oftentimes found herself in very difficult situations. She spoke out about the double standards and harassment she faced, particularly with the department's treatment of female officers, which didn't win her many friends. From the start, Laurie experienced severe gender discrimination, and she was also very attractive and feminine, so that didn't make the situation any better. Some officers refused to take her seriously, dismissing her as a pretty face who didn't belong in the world of policing. Again, her good looks and divine attitude didn't help at all, but she wasn't trying to fit into their mold, and that irked many of her male colleagues. Laurie's time in the police department was short-lived, but the experience she had was critical in shaping the next phase of her life. She started to develop a reputation not just as a beautiful woman who wanted to rise above her station, but as someone who didn't know her place and refused to back down when she was faced with opposition. Laurie's defiance of the gender roles within the police department earned her the label of troublemaker, and she was eventually fired after filing a discrimination complaint against the police department. Soon enough, she became even more ostracized. Laurie had painted a target on her back by challenging not just the institutional sexism, but also the underlying corruption. You see, Laurie was one of the 100 women in a force of 2,000 men. The rumors were that the male cops would hang out at a bar named Tracks, and there a whole lot of illegal activity would go on. We're talking about gambling, sexual solicitation, rubbing shoulders with hardened criminals, and dealing in trading stolen guns. Everyone knew about this. The cops didn't hide it. So when Laurie and her roommate Judy Zess were arrested for smoking at a concert, Laurie was forced to make an off-duty police report. But things didn't go her way. She was accused of filing a false police report and she was fired. But of course, Laurie's sense of justice would not allow this. Not long after she was fired, Laurie came across some images of several male officers at a party in a park. The party was sponsored by none other than Trax Bar, and it was a rowdy event. In these images, cops were seen stripping naked and dancing in front of children. Laurie got a hold of all these photos and brought them to the police department and tried to highlight that she was being discriminated against because these cops were doing all these illegal things and were seeing no consequences. Little did Laurie know that in one of those photos, her future husband, Fred Schultz, was present. Fred was a known partier, and whenever he drank or did drugs, he would become belligerent and violent. This seemingly random connection would change the entire course of Laurie's life for the worse. Laurie's claims about the corruption in the Milwaukee Police Department weren't baseless. They were murmurs and later documented evidence that pointed corruption running deep within the department. Laurie's lawsuit put her in direct conflict with the Milwaukee Police Department power structure. She was threatening their jobs, their reputation, and potentially their freedom if any of the corruption claims were to stick. Laurie filed a lawsuit against the department citing wrongful termination and discrimination. She claimed she was dismissed because of her gender and because she spoke out about police misconduct. Her battle against the Milwaukee Police Department was brewing as she met Fred Schultz. At the time, Fred was still married to Christine Schultz. When Laurie started dating Fred, it wasn't just a whirlwind romance. It was a situation loaded with tension because Fred was still part of the police force that she was actively fighting. Fred eventually divorced Christine, and just 6 months later, him and Laurie got married. It was fast, but to Laurie, it was true love until the murder. On May 28th, 1981, Christine Schultz, Fred's ex-wife, was found murdered in her home. The scene was pretty brutal. She was found bound and gagged and shot in the back. Her kids were the ones that discovered her body, which I can't even imagine their trauma. There were no signs of forced entry, so the killer had to have either been let in or had the keys. Now, Fred did have a spare key because he secretly made a copy from his older son's set of keys. Initially, the notion of Fred as a suspect was up in the air, but after he gave an alibi that was backed up by his partner, the suspicion quickly fell onto Laurie. And just like that, Laurie's nightmare began. Laurie was quickly arrested, and before she could face trial, the presumption of innocence was gone. The theory was that Laurie had used Fred's off-duty gun and jogged 18 blocks to Christine's home. There, she tied up Christine and attempted to physically assault her 2 children before fatally shooting her in the back. The thing is, the theory was already a stretch. Why would Laurie jog the route there and risk being seen? Also, Christine and Laurie were pretty similar in stature. Couldn't Christine have overpowered Laurie? Sure, Laurie had police training and would have known how to subdue someone. But when it comes to strength in the face of danger, it's unlikely that would have served her that much better. The prosecution in Laurie Bembenek's trial worked hard to paint her as a woman with a deadly motive. They claimed Laurie killed Christine because of jealousy and resentment over Fred's child support payments, believing Laurie wanted Christine out of the way so her and Fred could live a more comfortable life. I mean, Fred was indeed paying about $700 in alimony and child support to Christine, and it was eating into Laurie and Fred's lifestyle. The prosecution focused heavily on this motive, using it as the foundation for their case. In their narrative, Laurie was not only jealous of Christine, but also frustrated with the child support obligations Fred had to fulfill. Before Christine's murder, Laurie had made several comments about her, which became key points in the investigation and trial. Laurie had reportedly expressed frustration and disdain towards Christine, as her marriage to Fred became more strained. The financial pressures exacerbated Laurie's frustration, and she allegedly made remarks about how Christine's death would make things easier. These comments were later presented by the prosecution as possible evidence of motive, fueling the theory that Laurie had a personal vendetta against Christine. Laurie's defense team countered these claims by suggesting that the remarks, if they were made, were exaggerated and taken out of context. They argue that many of Laurie's frustrations were typical in the context of blended families and financial disputes and were not necessarily indications of a murderous intent. Now, let's get into the night of the murder. The night of Christine's murder was meticulously analyzed. Christine had been shot in the back at a close range in her own home while her two sons were nearby. Her hands were bound, and her sons said that they saw a masked figure with long reddish brown hair and was wearing a green jogging suit. From the beginning, this was painted as a cold, calculated crime. The prosecution leaned on a few critical pieces of evidence to make the case against Laurie. Let's start with the key evidence. A brownish red wig was found in a drain can near Laurie's house just days after the murder, which became a pivotal piece of evidence. The prosecution argued that Laurie wore this wig during the murders to disguise herself. As for the off-duty gun belonging to Fred, it was back at home with Laurie that night, so she could have easily accessed it. Sean and Shannon Schultz were inside the home on the night of the murder. Sean, the older son, testified that he saw a person with a green jogging suit enter his mother's room, and even though he couldn't identify who this person was, they had a red wig with a ponytail. In Christine's mouth was a blue bandana, which the prosecution alleged there were strands of blonde hair on it. This description would later play a huge role in linking Laurie to the murder because, as we know, she does have blonde hair. However, Sean admitted that he only saw the back of the head of the intruder, which brought the reliability into question. But Sean was able to give a description that the assailant was huge, and his hand, when placed on Shannon, the youngest, it was far too big to be that of Laurie's. Nonetheless, at the trial, the boys were terrified and there were a lot of inconsistencies, which makes sense because they experienced something very traumatic. Shannon also said that he heard his mom screaming for help, which added to the emotional weight of the testimony. Aside from Christine's sons, the prosecution relied on a series of witnesses to build their case against Laurie. Judy Zest was called onto the stand, and she claimed that she heard Laurie speak about wanting to get rid of Christine. She also confirmed that Laurie did own a green jogging suit, but the reliability of Judy's testimony was questioned because she was a known informant who had previously provided information in exchange for leniency in her own legal troubles. But this unreliability wasn't really highlighted in the trial, and as far as the jury knew, Judy was a pretty sound witness. Another important witness was a man named Dennis Hackett, a friend of Fred Schultz. Dennis testified that he had loaned Fred a .38 caliber handgun, the same type of gun that was used in the murder. While Dennis did not directly implicate Laurie, his testimony raised questions about Fred's role and access to the weapon. Hair samples that were found at the crime scene were supposedly a match to Laurie, but this evidence was circumstantial and not definitive. Fibers from the wig were found near Laurie's apartment, but again, fiber evidence can be difficult to rely on because of contamination concerns and the ease with such evidence can be manipulated. Laurie's defense team tried to argue that she was being framed and pointed to Fred Schultz as a potential suspect. They painted Fred as someone who had both motive and opportunity to kill his ex-wife. However, they had an uphill battle. The prosecution successfully painted Laurie as a jealous and vengeful woman, and the jury was influenced by the narrative that she wanted Christine out of the picture. The defense also tried to poke holes in the credibility of the police investigation, pointing out that Laurie had filed a discrimination complaint against the Milwaukee Police Department and had clashed with several officers. They argued that this gave the police department a reason to turn against her and possibly manipulate the evidence. But the problem was the police officers were testifying for the prosecution and their testimony carried weight with the jury. Let's talk about how Laurie's image impacted the trial. Throughout the proceedings, she was portrayed as a femme fatale, a manipulative woman who was able to use her looks and charms to get what she wanted. The media and the prosecution painted Laurie as a dangerous woman, mainly because of her appearance and because she was a police officer. The attitude towards women, especially women in traditionally male male roles like law enforcement was still looked down upon in the early 1980s. So when Laurie found herself on trial, it wasn't just her actions being scrutinized, it was also her appearance, her character, and the fact that she didn't conform to typical expectations of how women should behave. The media was all over Laurie, noting her wardrobe and demeanor. If she dressed conservatively, they accused her of pretending to be more demure than she was. If she wore something striking, the femme fatale angle would be brought up once again. Laurie just couldn't win. The bias towards women was never explicitly stated, but it certainly lingered in the air. A female defendant, especially one as striking and outspoken like Laurie, was easy to demonize. The narrative of a jealous woman was something that the jury resonated with, even if it wasn't fully supported by the facts. Fred's involvement in the investigation was another controversial point. Despite his proximity to the case as Christine's ex-husband and Laurie's new spouse, he was never really considered a suspect. This raised eyebrows. Why didn't investigators dig deeper into Fred's possible involvement? Some speculate it was because Fred was a police officer and the department is reluctant in investigating one of their own. Something that's interesting is that right after Christine's murder, Fred and Michael Durfee, a fellow detective that also backed up Fred's alibi, went to Fred's apartment that he shared with Laurie and retrieved the off-duty gun. They had to make sure that it hadn't been fired, and then they would make a report that would clear Fred from any suspicion. Michael Durfee himself checked the gun and said that there was a lot of dust in it, therefore it looks like it hasn't been fired for some time. The presence of solvents would indicate that someone had tried to clean the residue of the gun had it been fired. Michael Durfee supposedly wrote all this information down on his notes along with the serial number of the gun, but when they wanted to bring this evidence into the trial, he said that he destroyed all his notes. So why would he do this? Both Michael and Fred were seasoned detectives for more than 10 years, so if anyone was going to know the standard procedure, it was going to be them, but neither of them followed it. When the gun was brought up at trial, the prosecution claimed that the bullet had been traced back to it, but what they didn't admit was that when they were asked to turn in the gun to the FBI for further testing, they refused. But the biggest red flag is this: the bullet hole in Christine's back also had the imprint of the gun muzzle, which was about 200% larger than the gun used in court. So was it even the same gun? Laurie's defense team hinted that Fred was the real culprit, or at the very least, he had reason to frame Laurie. He had motive considering his financial obligation with Christine and the tension he had in his marriage with Laurie. But these claims didn't get much traction in court. Whether it was because Fred was in the police force or because they had already focused so much of their time on Laurie, Fred was left relatively untouched during the trial. He was also the only person in the entire trial that was granted immunity. The forensic evidence in this case has been a subject of debate for years. From the hair samples to the wig, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but nothing that definitively proved that Laurie was at the scene of the crime. In fact, several years after the trial, advances in forensic science cast doubt on the validity of the original evidence. Tests on the hair samples and fibers weren't as conclusive as the prosecution had initially claimed. One shocking example of this was the testimony of the city medical examiner Elaine Samuels. She would later go on to say on the record that when she first tested the blue bandana that was found in Christine's mouth, she did not find any blonde strands in it. Yet a day later, after the bandana had been in police evidence, she magically found these blonde strands, which is so crazy that something like this would be overlooked. This suggests that the hair was planted there and someone close to Laurie may have taken her hair from her hairbrush. Many have argued that the evidence was mishandled and even tampered with. Laurie herself maintained her innocence and said that she was framed, and the defense highlighted that the Milwaukee Police Department had motive to want Laurie out of the picture, especially because they had so much conflict with her in the past. There were also questions about how the evidence was collected and whether the police had a tunnel vision in pursuing Laurie as a suspect. Despite the gaps in evidence and many unanswered questions, Laurie was convicted of first-degree murder in March 1982 and was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction shocked some, but many people were convinced that it was the correct outcome given the way the trial played out. In the courtroom, Laurie Bembenek became the latest in a long list of women vilified as dangerous, manipulative, and guilty. It was like a witch hunt, and of course, the prosecution had a worthy target, a woman who defied expectations. Now, let's step back and ask, how likely is it that Laurie was being set up? Her lawsuit against the Milwaukee Police Department made her a liability. There's a theory that the police department was eager to find a scapegoat for Christine Schultz's murder, and Laurie was a perfect target. With Fred Schultz being a respected police officer and Laurie being a disturbance in the department's eyes, some have speculated that she was framed to take the fall for the crime. After all, Laurie had been a problem for the Milwaukee Police Department for some time, especially after she spoke out against them, and now she was tangled up in a high-profile murder case. Laurie's story is also emblematic of how female officers were treated in law enforcement in that era. The resentment towards her, especially after the lawsuit, was palpable. She wasn't just a woman in a man's world, she was a woman who dared to challenge that world. It would make sense that she had been a target due to her prior accusations against the Milwaukee Police Department, and that the police had rushed to pin the crime on her without thoroughly investigating other possible suspects. Alright, let's break this down and get into why some people think Fred Schultz might have been the one behind his ex-wife Christine Schultz's murder and not Laurie Bembenek. Fred had a clear motive. Starting with his rocky divorce from Christine, she was awarded custody of their 2 children as well as a hefty child support payment, which definitely put a strain in his financial situation. They didn't exactly part on good terms, and we know that kind of bitterness can linger. Christine Schultz's lawyer later admitted that after the murder, he had called the police to report that Christine's last words to him were that she feared for her life because Fred had threatened to blow her head off. Fred was also just months into a new relationship with Laurie, and if his finances were tied up in child support, this could have caused stress in their relationship. A lot of people think that killing Christine could have been a twisted solution to both his financial woes and personal issues. His marriage to Christine had been rough, and divorces with bad blood can sometimes fuel irrational, even violent behavior. And with Fred's tendency to become violent, it would make sense that he would snap. And let's not forget, Fred was also a Milwaukee police officer, so he had access to weapons and knowledge of police protocols. Now, we all know that the gun allegedly used to kill Christine was Fred's off-duty gun, but police say that it was Laurie who somehow stole it and pulled the trigger. That's where things get murky. How would Laurie, with no direct access to police weapons, get her hands on the murder weapon? Fred, on the other hand, could have easily accessed the gun, or at the very least known how to cover his tracks. He could have easily framed Laurie, knowing how the system works and how to manipulate evidence. Additionally, Laurie had been a cop, so she knows that bullets can be traced back to the gun. So if she knew all of that, then why would she be stupid enough to use Fred's gun? Now, Fred claims that on the night of the murder, he was working as a security guard, but he later admitted that he was actually at a bar with Michael Durfee. Durfee confirmed this. He had an alibi, right? But the thing is, it wasn't airtight. There are gaps in the timeline where Fred's whereabouts are unclear. So while he was technically home, there's suspicion about whether he had time to slip away, commit the crime, and then return unnoticed. Some people wonder if Fred's alibi was a little too convenient and whether someone at the bar who was close to him would cover for him. It wouldn't be unheard of for a cop to get a favor from a friend, especially if it meant diverting attention away from a murder. There's also the issue of Fred and Laurie's relationship. Fred and Laurie's marriage was not exactly a fairy tale. There were reports of arguments and tension between them. It's not out of the question to think that Fred would set up Laurie to take the fall for Christine's murder. If he wanted out of this new marriage with Laurie and get rid of his child support obligations with Christine, then framing Laurie would have been a twisted solution. And remember, Laurie was viewed a bit of a femme fatale. Her reputation as a striking, headstrong woman likely did didn't help her case with the police department and the public. With Laurie painted as the villain, it's easier to overlook Fred's involvement. Finally, we can't ignore the role of the Milwaukee Police Department in this whole saga. It's not a stretch to think that some of Fred's colleagues might have had a grudge against Laurie and were eager to believe the worst of her. This hostile atmosphere might have been easier for Fred to manipulate the case. And considering how tight-knit police forces can be, it wouldn't be surprising if the details were conveniently overlooked. After Laurie's incarceration, Fred was vocal that he supported his wife and that he was convinced that she didn't do it. He also claimed that he would wait for Laurie forever, but this was short-lived. Just 3 months after her imprisonment, he sent her a letter that said, "Good luck and goodbye." And with that, they got divorced. But Laurie's incarceration would not be the end of her story. Eventually, she would go on to break out of prison, and this would be one of the most dramatic chapters of her life. In 1990, after spending 8 years behind bars, Laurie successfully broke out of prison with the help of her fiancé, Dominic Gulato, which was the brother of a fellow inmate. Laurie squeezed out of a laundry room window and ran to where Dominic was waiting for her. Together, they fled to Canada, where they lived under assumed names for 3 months before being captured. Laurie became a national sensation during this time, with headlines calling her Bambi on the run. Her escape prompted widespread media attention, sparkling new interest in her case. Surprisingly, Laurie had a bunch of supporters who were making bumper stickers, shirts, and signs that read, "Run, Bambi, run." Even a few songs were released around that time using the same slogan. From the outside, it seemed that the tide had turned when it came to public opinion about her innocence. During her time on the run, Laurie maintained her innocence, saying that she fled not because she was guilty, but because she had been wrongfully convicted. Rather than immediately extraditing Laurie, Canadian officials took the unusual step to grant her a hearing to review the evidence against her. And what they found raised serious questions about her conviction. There were so many inconsistencies in the prosecution's case that had never been addressed. For one, Christine's son had always said that the killer was a man and not a woman. He described the intruder as having broad, square shoulders, which is very different from Laurie's build. There was also male DNA found under Christine's fingernails, which was never tested. And the wig found in the pipes just days after Christine's murder was suspiciously convenient. How could Laurie flush an entire wig down the toilet without causing an immediate clog? And why would she risk someone calling a plumber if she was trying to hide evidence? I feel like someone like Laurie, who was in the police department, would know stuff like this and would refrain from doing it. There was also questions about the hair found on Christine's body. As mentioned before, Elaine Samuels, who processed the scene, said that she did not collect any blonde strands of hair, and she only found brown hair which belonged to Christine. So where did this supposed match to Laurie come from? Eventually faced with the possibility of an embarrassing retrial, prosecutors offered Laurie a deal. Plead no contest to second-degree murder in exchange for time served. After serving 10 years for a crime she insisted that she did not commit, Laurie Bembenek was free. But freedom did not bring peace to Laurie. She continued to fight to clear her name, appearing on talk shows and giving interviews to proclaim her innocence. In a bizarre twist, she even agreed to undergo DNA testing on Dr. Phil's show in 2003. But Laurie never got her definitive answer. Suffering from anxiety and PTSD, she jumped out of a second-story window while she waited to get a DNA test done, and she shattered her leg so badly it had to be amputated. Laurie would move on and try to find steady work, but every time her employers learned about her past, she would be fired. Laurie advocated for her cause for the rest of her life, but she never got to see her acquittal. She spent the final years very sick, struggling with hepatitis C that she contracted in prison, and she was dealing with the effects of drug and alcohol abuse. She died in 2010 at just 52 years old, her innocence neither proven or disproven. Later on in the years, more and more information would come out about the case, particularly that on Judy Zess. Over the years, Judy recanted her statement and contradicted the testimony that she had made at Laurie's trial. In 1984, when an investigator offered to give her money for the story, she allegedly claimed that yes, the police had covered up the murder. She even underwent underwent a stress test and passed, saying that there was a conspiracy to frame Laurie. It also came out that the day before the wig was found in the drain of the apartment building, Laurie stayed in and Judy had stopped by and asked to use the neighbor's bathroom. Laurie and this neighbor shared the same drain. It was directly after this that the drain got clogged. Additionally, Judy owned a brownish red wig. The ties with Judy don't stop there. A month after Christine's murder, some henchmen broke into Judy's home. These henchmen were well-known associates of another interesting connection, a man named Fred Horenberger. Fred was a known criminal. In fact, he had a strategy he used when robbing houses. He would wear a wig, army clothes, and a bandana. He was also a very large man and was known to be a former weightlifter, which it sounds that this description perfectly matches the person that murdered Christine. But that's not where the connection stops. Fred was known to frequent at Track's Bar, which is where all the cops from the Milwaukee Police Department would go and hang out, including Fred Schultz. He had also briefly worked with Fred on a remodeling project and was the former boyfriend of Judy says. This was all too much of a coincidence. After the trial, 8 witnesses came forward and said that on the night of Christine's murder, they saw a man with a green jacket wandering around the neighborhood. Was this Fred? Unfortunately, before this theory could be investigated, Fred Horenberger took his life in 1991. The motive was there: the botched investigation, the shady alibis, the amount of involvement of Fred at the scene. He arrived after his kids called, and instead of being turned away from the scene, he was allowed to examine it. Was Fred the culprit the entire time? All we know is that a beautiful and ambitious young woman named Laurie Bembenek had everything taken from her. Whether guilty or innocent, she spent 10 years behind bars and then the rest of her life trying to outrun the shadow of Christine Schultz's murder. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our justice system. How can we be certain of guilt when evidence is circumstantial? What safeguards are in place to prevent corrupt officials from framing an innocent person? It seems more and more that there was foul play involved in the case, yet Laurie will never see justice. It's one of life's horrible reminders that the good guy doesn't always win. Laurie Bembenek's case isn't just a tragic story, it's a reminder that justice is fragile and easily tainted by bias, corruption, and a flawed system. Her life, marked by ambition, defiance, and resilience, ended in a fight for truth she may never have fully been able to prove. Whether guilty or innocent, Laurie Bembenek's case exposed cracks in the justice system. Her death leaves a lingering question: can we ever truly know what happened? It seems unlikely. What do you think about this case? Was Laurie set up? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more true crime deep dives. This is Kari, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.